recognize the value of science and invest in it. What we haven't seen until now, and this is part of the tragedy of the current moment, up until now, attacks on science have typically come from fascistic, autocratic governments, the Nazis, some branches of the Soviet government. Until now, we had never seen a democratic government turn against science. We are seeing that in the United States today. So one could draw one of two conclusions. One can draw the conclusion that democratic governments are not necessarily supportive of science, or one could draw the conclusion that the current American government is not democratic.
So from Merchants of Doubt to the Big Myth, years of work between the first book and this last one, but there is a sort of a red line connecting the two. Can you walk us a little bit through between the starting point and where we got?
I think of the two books as, in a way, a pair, because the first is the what and the second is the why. So in Merchants of Doubt, we were trying to explain what was going on. Who was denying climate change? There was some why were they doing it? But especially, what were the techniques? What were the strategies and tactics that enabled these people to cast doubt on rather solid science, not just about climate change, but about the harms of tobacco and the harms of other environmental issues like the ozone hole. So in that book, we really focused on the what. What were they doing and how were they doing it? But then we wanted to answer the question of why. And at the end of that book, we answered it a little bit, and we showed that it was really driven by political ideology, the ideology of market fundamentalism, the idea that you really don't want the government getting involved in the economy, because if the government gets involved in the economy, that would somehow lead to a sort of slippery slope to the government getting involved in your personal life, your private life, and a loss of freedom. And that was the argument we laid out in Merchants of Doubt. But when we finished that book, we thought, well, okay, the evidence was clear. We had these men saying these things in their own words, but why would they think that? Because if you think about history, I mean, it's perfectly obvious from history that markets are good at some things and bad at others, that markets fail, and that we need governance to both regulate markets, but also to prevent monopolistic practices, to protect workers. And these are lessons for which we have hundreds of years of history. So why would someone not believe the lessons of history? And so in the second book, we dig much deeper into that question.
Right. And where did you get to into this digging? Like, because this is really, it's also kind of a big book with a lot of research and really brings us back in history, but also on the frontiers of what we're living now, in a way.
It is a big book, and it's as big as it is in part because we found so much more than we thought. We thought that the whole anti-government politics had really developed with Ronald Reagan, and in Europe to a certain extent with Margaret Thatcher in the United Kingdom. But when we began to dig into it, we found a much bigger, much longer, and much older story that really went back to the beginning of the 20th century and debates about the failures and abuses of capitalism in the late 19th and early 20th century, particularly debates about child labor, because the free market was massively exploiting children, both in Europe and in the United States, and about workplace injury, particularly in the United States, where hundreds of thousands of workers were being killed every single year on the job. And American industrialists actually traveled to Europe to figure out why were so many fewer workers dying in Germany or in the United Kingdom than in the United States. And the answer they found was workmen's compensation, insurance programs that created an incentive for factory owners to make a safer workplace. And so this triggered a huge debate in the United States about whether there should be regulations, whether there should be requirements, whether workmen's compensation should be required by law. And in the United States, the answer to that question, as it was in Germany and England, was yes, it should be required. And it was, and factories became much safer, but it triggered a backlash. It triggered a movement by business leaders to push back against the idea that the government had a role to play in protecting workers, banning child labor, and things like that.
If you look at the picture today, in a way, we see that Europe or the United States have reached a point where, for example, workers' rights are more protected, although in a different way, and some of these rights have been regulated. But then we are kind of pushing the boundaries in other places, right? So I'm thinking about the digital transition, the innovation we're working on today, all of these frontiers sort of developments, even by companies that are that have a place in Europe or in the US, then they are actually using labor force or exploiting environments in other countries where the regulation is maybe not as strict. And that's maybe, again, the same situation, but in a global sort of perspective.
Absolutely. We think our book is very timely and very relevant to what's going on in Europe right now. When we first wrote the book, um, our Italian publisher said, well, I don't know about an Italian translation. It's a very American book. And we said, well, it is and it isn't. It's about what happened in America, but we see these same issues now uh, coming up in Europe as well. And in the 2 years since I first had that conversation with my editor, now I think my publisher has realized, oh my goodness, this is so relevant to Europe for two reasons. First, as you suggested, we have the emergence of a whole new technology, artificial intelligence, and just the spread of social media, the whole network of internet activities that are causing a whole new set of harms, particularly to teenagers, but also threatening the livelihood of many workers. So what do we do about that? And what role should government play in, say, protecting teenagers from the harms of internet activity? Or in America, online gambling is now exploding and many young people are finding themselves addicted to online gambling. So what should the role of government be in protecting those young people and regulating this marketplace? And you have tech executives saying, oh, no, we don't need to be regulated. And not only that, they say, you can't regulate us because you don't understand what we do. So that's a new version of an old argument. In the early 20th century, people said, you can't regulate us because how could the government know how to run my business? Surely I know better than the government how to run my own business. So in a way, the tech executives are making the same argument again today. And then the other part of it just has to do with the pushback that we're seeing in Europe, partly because of the influence of the United States, to argue that Europe is over-regulated, particularly we just saw these past few weeks the Trump administration trying to push back on the European digital privacy protections. So the United States is playing, in my opinion, a very retrograde role in trying to negatively influence Europe not to protect its workers and its teenagers and its children. And I think the lesson of history is, sure, markets are good at many things. Markets are excellent at producing, lots of clothing, for example. But when it comes to protecting workers, protecting children, and protecting the natural environment, we have 200, 300 years of history to tell us that the market, the so-called free market, left to its own devices, will do tremendous damage. And so you need a balance between the activities of businessmen and industrialists and protecting other interests of society.
There is also an impression I got when I was reading the two books one after the other, thinking of there is a pattern there. I mean, different type of industries, coming one after the other. Now we're going into the digital or internet industries, and it was different before, the tobacco industries or so on and so forth, the fossil fuel ones. I mean, different type of industries, different type of activities, but more or less the players are the same. The type of characters, they seem the same. There is a pattern going through and through, and even the way they act is very much the same.
Yes.
And they don't come from some obscure angle. They are really inside the actual institutions and and academies that we know. So that's also something that people might not always be aware of. And we don't always see that with clarity.
Yes, I think that's right. And I think that's why history is so important. There's a tendency for people to think that history is just old and dusty and boring, or to think history is not relevant now because the technology is so different. And of course, that's what the tech executives want us to think. They want us to think that the lessons of history no longer apply. But I think the truth is that people don't change. The technology may change, but humans, human nature, human greed, human ambition, human self-justification and self-rationalization, and human treachery, for lack of a better word, these things don't change. And so one reason I think this work is so important, and I hope the book is powerful, is you see the way the same arguments, the same rationalizations, and the same dishonesty is repeated and recycled over and over again.
And how do you think, I mean, obviously understanding this and seeing it through, this is the first important step. But is there a way, I mean, at the moment we look at the situation where the attack on science is very strong. It's not only in the US, also in Europe. There are all of these tension and conflicts that seem to put environmental concerns or health concern a bit on the side. How do you think the knowledge environment, the people who are concerned can actually react? Or what's the space for an action here, if there is any?
Well, I think there's many spaces for action. I think the most important lesson that I took from writing this work is to reject false dichotomies, because so much of this work, so much of the deception works by setting up a false dichotomy. So in the big myth, the key false dichotomy that is set up in the 20th century is the dichotomy between the free market, the idea of a completely free, essentially unregulated market, and Soviet-style centralized planning and totalitarianism. And the argument that the American businessmen make is that if you permit the government to regulate the marketplace, even in a modest way, like limiting child labor, you're on the slippery slope to totalitarianism. Now, that's of course false. And we know it's false, first of all, because we are people of intelligence and judgment, and we can make choices. And we can say, no, we don't think it should be legal to hire children under the age of 15 in a factory. And it doesn't mean that we have to plan the economy, right? These are different questions, and we can distinguish these questions. And also because we now have more than 100 years of history, particularly here in Europe, but in the United States as well, demonstrating that you can have a social democracy, you can have a strong welfare, social welfare safety net, you can protect the rights of children and workers and protect the natural environment and still have a thriving economy, still have great universities. So many of the things we want in a democratic society, we can't have them both. As we say, we can have our cake and eat it too. And we don't necessarily have to choose. We just have to make intelligent decisions about what our values are and where we draw the line. And, in the debates over child labor, there were big debates about whether teenagers were children, right? Is a 15-year-old a child? Well, the point is, you don't actually have to answer that question. You can simply say, well, I don't know if a teenager is a child or not, but I don't think someone under 14 should be working in a factory.
Yeah. There is also another, I mean, sort of myth or idea that is quite rooted, and it's in fact probably was more rooted in the US, I'm not sure, but here it is becoming more and more an argument, which is in a very regulated state, or when the state is actually acting as a key player in society, innovation lags behind. There is this idea that, for example, Europe is not innovating enough or not at the same pace than the US because we have heavy regulation. I know you're against this argument.
I have to take a deep breath because I want to just say that is so false that I just want to say to anyone who has listened to that argument, no, it's just not true. And it's not true in lots of levels because, first of all, Europe has a great history of innovation. I mean, we're sitting here today at the great university in Padua. So much great science and technology has developed in Europe. So the idea that somehow Europe is a laggard is simply not true. But also because very often the government is the source of innovation. Now, that might sound like a strange claim, so let me explain. And here I'd like to invoke the work of Mariana Mazzucato, who I assume is Italian, but she teaches in England.
Yeah.
Her very wonderful book, The Entrepreneurial State. In fact, at one point, Eric Conway and I had an idea actually to write that book, but she wrote it first. And I was good. Okay, we can move on to other things. It's a brilliant book because she makes an incredibly important argument that many people don't know. If you look at the major transformative technologies of the last 150 years or so, not a single one of them, not a single one was developed in the private sector by the private sector alone. They were either developed mostly by governments, for example, space travel or the internet, which was invented by the US government, or they were developed in public-private partnerships, railroad, telegraph, telephone, television, radio. All of these were done in partnerships. And then, as I said, the space program was really created by the Russian and American governments. The internet was invented by the US government, who hired the scientists and funded the science, but it wasn't the private sector. Now the private sector has done lots of things, and they act as if they invented the internet when they did not. They promote a mythology of guys in a garage, but without the government investment in what was originally known as DARPANET, which was developed as a military communication system, we wouldn't have the internet today. We wouldn't have social media. We wouldn't have GPS. We wouldn't have any of the things. We wouldn't have online shopping, for better or worse, right? So, I mean, this is just a complete misrepresentation of history. If you want innovation, what you need is strong public sector investment in basic science and technology. And then you do need to have means to, what we call tech transfer. And, Al Gore is much maligned by the right wing in America, but one of the most important things he did was he wrote the legislation that facilitated the transfer of the internet from the public to the private sector. And that laid the foundations for all of what has happened since then. But without that initial government investment, we would have none of these technologies that the tech bros are so busy boasting about today.
I have one last question, Naomi, which is we kind of associate again innovation and freedom of science with democracy a lot. But maybe again it's sort of a naive argument, because the world today is much more complicated and complex, and there are countries or entire parts of the world who are not that democratic and yet are advancing in science very.
It's a very complicated question what the relationship is between science, democracy, individual liberty, and also capitalism. And I think there's no question that there is some argument for a kind of natural resonance between science and democracy because of the way science relies on individual initiative, curiosity, the willingness to challenge accepted wisdom. So I think all of these sorts of values do have a natural resonance with democratic polity. But at the same time, we know that science thrived in the Soviet Union. We know the Soviet government invested tremendously, and not just in applied science, but in basic sciences like basic mathematics. And we see in China today very extensive investment in scientific research, medicine, biomedicine. So I think the real question is really the attitude of the government. And we've seen in history both democratic governments and non-democratic governments recognize the value of science and invest in it. What we haven't seen until now, and this is part of the tragedy of the current moment, up until now, attacks on science have typically come from fascistic autocratic governments, the Nazis, some branches of the Soviet government. Until now, we had never seen a democratic government turn against science. We are seeing that in the United States today. So one could draw one of two conclusions. One can draw the conclusion that democratic governments are not necessarily supportive of science, or one can draw the conclusion that the current American government is not democratic.
Yeah, I'd like to close on this, but that really draws me to another little question, which is really connected to this, though. I mean, you come from a university, which is Harvard University, is the most ancient institution in the U.S. It's almost 400 years old, right? 390 next year. So,
Yes.
and it's the university that has standing up against the government attack more than other universities have managed to do. So I know it might seem a silly question, but are you somehow optimistic, or where do you see space for some optimism in terms of thinking about your students? I know you are also teaching and younger researchers. Where do you see a space for, I'm not saying optimism, but like a sort of a positive outcome of this moment?
Well, I do have to say, my own university aside, I think the leadership of American universities have really let down the side. It has been shocking to me how few presidents and chancellors of universities have stood up to defend the basic values of academic freedom. And this is very shocking to me, but I think it is in part because in the last 30 or 40 years, Americans have been so persuaded of the values of business that we have many universities now being run by businesses and by people who don't actually understand what the central function of the university should be. And so when put in a situation where they had to defend core academic values, they found themselves unable to do so. What makes me feel less discouraged is that my own university has stood up and defended core academic values, but more than that, I think the students and the faculty. I think that we, the faculty and the students, we know why we're there. We know why we do what we do. And personally, it's very gratifying for me to be here today because I do consider that what I do to be part of a great 1,000-year tradition of people committed to learning and to knowledge and to understanding the role that knowledge can play in so many ways in helping the economy of a society thrive, but also just in making life better. Because when you look at the moon through a telescope and you see those craters, it's just amazing, right? And you have a deepened sense of what your own value is as a person, what the value of knowledge is, and that no matter what exactly, however you think about the role of mankind in the universe, that we are part of some really big, really great project. And it's not just about me and the students I'm teaching today or the book that I published this year, but that I really do believe that I'm part of a millennial-long project, which has been one of the great projects of humanity.
Naomi Oreskes, thank you very much.
Thank you.